The rain fell against the hospital's automatic doors like 1,000 tiny fists. Liam's small hand was a clammy weight in his father's. At 5 years old, the sprawling university hospital was a universe of terrifying smells and echoing noises, a world away from their cramped, perpetually damp apartment. Ben knelt, his worn jacket straining across his shoulders, and brushed a strand of hair from his son's forehead. "Just a quick check-up, champ. Like at Drive, Miller's, but bigger. Then we can get a hot chocolate. With extra marshmallows." Liam's lower lip trembled, his eyes, the same deep blue as his mother's, pooled with unshed tears. "I don't feel good, Daddy." "I know, buddy, I know." Ben's heart clenched, a familiar, painful squeeze. It was the same feeling he got every time he looked at the final notice for the electricity bill, or when Liam woke up crying from a dream of a woman whose face was beginning to blur. It was the feeling of drowning in slow motion. They sat in the bustling waiting area, a study in stillness amidst the controlled chaos. Ben, at 32, looked a decade older. The struggles of single fatherhood, of working 2 jobs that barely covered the rent and Liam's mounting medical bills, were etched into the lines around his eyes. Liam, pale and listless, leaned against him, his small body radiating a feverish heat. A sudden, sharper commotion came from the main entrance. A phalanx of suits, led by a tall, severe-looking man, parted the crowd. And in the center of it all was her. Dr. Evelyn Reed, the new CEO of the hospital. Her name had been splashed across business sections and local news for weeks. The brilliant, groundbreaking administrator hired to turn the struggling institution around. She was a vision in a tailored crimson dress, her auburn hair a sleek fall that caught the sterile light. She moved with an impossible grace, a queen surveying her kingdom, her voice a crisp, confident melody as she spoke to her subordinates. Ben barely registered her. He was too focused on the heat coming from his son, on the way Liam's breathing seemed a little too shallow. But Liam saw. His head, which had been resting heavily against Ben's arm, lifted. His eyes, glassy with fever, widened. He stared across the sea of chairs, past the coughing elderly man and the woman with a newborn, straight at the epicenter of power and polish that was Dr. Evelyn Reed. He tugged on Ben's sleeve, a sudden, surprising strength in his tiny fingers. "Daddy," he whispered, his voice a fragile reed in the hospital's din. "What is it, Liam?" Ben murmured, pulling him closer. Liam's small arm extended, one finger pointing directly at the woman in red. His face broke into a beatific, fever-dazzled smile, a look of pure, unadulterated recognition. "That's Mommy." The 2 words, clear and certain, cut through the ambient noise of the waiting room. They landed on Ben like a physical blow. The air left his lungs. The world seemed to tilt, the colors bleeding into a nauseating swirl. "No, Liam, no," Ben said, his voice tight with a panic he couldn't control. He gently tried to lower his son's arm. "That's not Mommy. That's a very important doctor." "But it is," Liam insisted, his voice rising with the plaintive logic of a child. "It's Mommy. Her picture is on my wall." He was right. The photo on Liam's nightstand, the one Ben could barely look at, was of a younger, softer version of this woman. A woman with laughing eyes and untamed curls, a woman who used to sing off-key in the kitchen and whose love had once felt like the only solid ground in the world. Alara. The commotion had drawn her attention. Evelyn Reed's gaze swept over them, a brief, professional glance meant to assess and dismiss a minor disturbance. For a fraction of a second, her eyes, a piercing, intelligent green, met Ben's. And the world stopped. Ben saw the flicker, a micro-expression of shock so profound it broke through her polished facade. Her step faltered. The folder in her hand slipped, papers fluttering to the polished floor like wounded birds. Her aides scrambled to retrieve them, but her eyes were locked on Ben. On the small, pale boy pointing at her. He saw the color drain from her face. He saw her lips, painted a perfect, professional shade of nude, part slightly. He saw a lifetime of memories, of love and loss and a pain so deep it had carved him hollow, reflected back at him in that single, stunned moment. One of her aides, a young man with a sharp suit and sharper eyes, stepped between them, his body a shield. "Dr. Reed, is everything all right?" Evelyn, Alara, didn't answer him. She was still staring, her composure shattered. Ben could feel the eyes of the entire waiting room on them. He felt exposed, raw, the most painful, private part of his life suddenly a public spectacle. He stood up, pulling Liam into his arms, holding him like a shield. His son buried his face in his neck, confused and frightened by the sudden tension. "Liam, let's go," Ben choked out, turning away from the ghost of his wife. He practically ran, pushing through the doors and back out into the cold, cleansing rain. He stood there, gasping, the water soaking through his jacket, mingling with the hot tears he could no longer hold back. Liam was crying now, too, soft, confused sobs. "Why did we leave, Daddy? That was Mommy." Ben held him tighter, his mind reeling. 4 years. 4 years since she'd walked out for a high-powered internship, in another state, a decision that had led to fights, then silence, then a single, cold letter from a lawyer. A letter that stated Alara was relinquishing all parental rights, that she wanted a new life, unencumbered. She had vanished, and the grief had nearly broken him. He'd rebuilt his life around one single, sacred purpose, being everything for the little boy she'd left behind. And now she was here. Not just here, but the CEO of the very hospital he'd brought their sick son to. The sheer, cruel impossibility of it was a knife to the heart. Inside, standing motionless amidst her stunned staff, Evelyn Reed watched the man and the boy disappear into the rain-smeared world. The aide handed her the recovered papers. Her hands were trembling. "Dr. Reed," he prompted again, his voice laced with concern and confusion. She finally looked away from the door, her mask of authority slamming back into place, but it was brittle, a cracked veneer. "It's nothing," she said, her voice unnaturally steady. "A momentary dizziness. Let's proceed to the boardroom." But as she walked away, her heels clicking a sharp, staccato rhythm on the floor, all she could see was Ben's devastated, accusing eyes. And the face of the little boy who had called her, Mommy. The little boy she had held in her arms only once, in a life that no longer felt like her own. The rain had turned into a persistent, gray drizzle, matching the murk inside Ben's mind. He drove on autopilot, Liam finally asleep in the backseat, exhausted by fever and emotion. The hot chocolate promise lay broken between them. Back in their silent apartment, the silence felt different. It was no longer just an absence of sound, it was filled with the ghost of a woman in a red dress. He put Liam to bed, watching the slow, labored rise and fall of his small chest. The fear for his son was a constant, gnawing companion, but now it was tangled with a fresh, searing anger. Alara, here, a CEO, while he struggled to keep a roof over their heads and medicine in the cabinet. While their son asked for a mother he was told was gone forever. A knock on the door, firm and authoritative, shattered the silence. His blood ran cold. He knew, with a sickening certainty, who it was. He opened the door to find her standing there. She had shed the power suit, now wearing a simple, expensive-looking black coat, her hair damp from the rain. The CEO was gone, and in her place stood a woman who looked terrified. The polish was stripped away, revealing the raw, trembling person beneath. "Ben," she breathed, his name a ghost on her lips. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, blocking the doorway, his body a wall of rage and pain. "Please," she whispered, her eyes begging. "Please, let me explain." Explain. The word was a bark of harsh, disbelieving laughter. "Explain what, Alara? Or is it Evelyn now? Explain how you abandoned your family. How you left me with a 2-year-old and a broken heart. Or maybe explain why you're here, in this city, the CEO of a goddamn hospital, while I've been barely keeping our son alive." His voice broke on the last word. He saw her flinch as if he'd struck her. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice trembling. "I never wanted to leave you. Either of you." The lawyer's letter said otherwise. Relinquishing parental rights. "That's pretty clear, Alara. Can I see him?" she asked, her gaze darting past him, into the dim apartment. Reluctantly, fueled by a bitter mix of hatred and a deep, residual love he could never fully extinguish, he stepped aside. She walked in, her eyes taking in the shabby furniture, the stack of unpaid bills on the coffee table, the small, worn sneakers by the door. Every detail was a fresh wound. She moved silently to the doorway of Liam's room. Ben watched from the hall as she stood there, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. She looked at the sleeping boy, at the photo of them, on his nightstand, and her shoulders shook with silent tears. When she turned back to him, her face was a mess of streaked mascara and anguish. "I was sick, Ben," she whispered, pulling a folded, weathered document from her coat pocket. She handed it to him with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking. It was a medical report. His eyes scanned the clinical language, the words blurring before snapping into horrifying focus. Diagnosis: glioblastoma multiforme, stage 4. Prognosis: poor. Median survival 12 to 18 months with aggressive treatment. The date was from just over 4 years ago. The world dropped out from under him. He stumbled back, collapsing into a worn armchair, the paper crinkling in his numb fingers. "They gave me a year, maybe a little more," Alara said, her voice hollow. "The treatments, they were brutal. Experimental. They would have bankrupted us, stolen every moment we had left, turned me into a ghost in our own home. I saw what it did to my mother. I couldn't do that to you. I couldn't let you and Liam watch me die. I couldn't let you inherit my medical debt." Ben could only stare, the foundation of his reality, the story he had built his pain and anger upon, crumbling to dust. "So, the internship," he managed to rasp. "A lie. I went to a specialist in Switzerland. My father, he had money. He paid for it, on one condition: I had to disappear. He said a clean break was the kindest thing. For you. He said you were young, you could rebuild, find someone else. He said Liam would forget me." A fresh wave of tears fell. He was wrong about that. The lawyer, the rights. To protect you, legally, you couldn't be held responsible for any of my debts. And I thought if you hated me, it would be easier to move on. The twist of the knife was so profound, so exquisitely cruel, he couldn't breathe. All the anger, the years of resentment, dissolved into a vast, aching void. She hadn't left them. She had sacrificed herself for them. She had chosen to die alone, to let them believe she was a monster, to save them from the slow, financial and emotional carnage of her death. The treatment, it worked. He finally asked, the question a fragile thing. "A miracle," she said, a bitter, broken smile touching her lips. "Against all odds, it sent the cancer into remission. It left me different. It took years to recover, to rebuild my strength, my career. This job, it was the first one that felt right. A way to make my second chance matter. I had no idea you were in this city. I thought you'd moved away, started over." They sat in the crushing silence, two shipwrecked survivors on the shores of a ruined past. Just then, a small, weak voice came from the bedroom. "Daddy." Ben and Alara both rushed in. Liam was sitting up, his eyes wide and clear. He looked from his father to the crying woman. "Mommy," he said, his voice small but sure. "You're really here." Alara crumpled. She fell to her knees by the bed, gathering him into her arms, sobbing into his hair. "Yes, baby, I'm here. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Ben watched them, his heart a battlefield of grief for the lost years and a terrifying, tentative hope. He reached out, his hand finding Alara's shoulder. She looked up at him, her eyes holding a universe of regret and a desperate, pleading love. For a moment, suspended in the quiet of the little room, it seemed like a future might be possible. A chance to stitch their broken family back together. And then Liam coughed. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a wet, ragged, desperate sound that seemed to tear right through his small body. He gasped, his little chest heaving, his face turning from pale to a terrifying shade of blue. "Liam!" Ben shouted, grabbing him. Alara, the doctor, instantly took over, her maternal panic shoved aside by professional instinct. She tilted his head, checking his airway. "He's in respiratory distress. Ben, we have to go. Now." Ben snatched the car keys, his hands shaking violently. Alara swept Liam into her arms, and they ran, a frantic, terrified unit, back out into the rain, back towards the hospital they had just fled. The drive was a blur of panic and run red lights. They screeched up to the entrance, and Ben burst through the doors, Alara right behind him, holding their gasping son. "My son, he can't breathe," Ben yelled. A team of nurses descended, transferring Liam to a gurney, an oxygen mask placed over his blue-tinged face. They rushed him through the swinging doors, leaving Ben and Alara standing in the sterile, bright chaos of the emergency room, their hands clinging to each other for the first time in 4 years. The doctor who came out 20 minutes later had a grim face. "Mr. Davies, Dr. Reed," he said, "we've stabilized him for now, but this is a severe pneumonia, complicated by his underlying condition. We've run some preliminary blood tests." Ben's mind was reeling. Underlying condition? What underlying condition? The doctor looked at him, then at Alara, his expression one of profound pity. You weren't aware." "Aware of what?" Ben demanded, his voice cracking. The doctor took a deep breath. "The tests indicate severe, congenital bone marrow failure. It's what's been causing the recurrent infections, the fatigue. Liam is very, very sick. He's going to need a hematopoietic stem cell transplant to survive." The words landed like physical blows. Ben felt the room spin. Alara's grip on his hand tightened to the point of pain. "A transplant," she whispered, her professional knowledge making the prognosis all the more terrifying. How do we find a donor?" "We'll start with immediate family," the doctor said gently. "Parents, siblings. They are always the first and best hope for a match." Ben and Alara looked at each other, a new, more profound horror dawning in their eyes. They were his only hope. The two people who had already been torn apart by one illness, now held the key to saving their son from another. The final, unforgettable twist of the knife was not in the past, but in the terrifying, uncertain future. Their second chance hadn't begun with a reunion, but with a fight for their son's life, a fight where they were the only two soldiers on the battlefield.